was to try to bring it all back to a point of reality for everybody, because the reality is we need to grow healthy children, we need healthy food. I don't care what it takes, but everybody should be around.
I'm Jon Biloon. This is Supernatural Agriculture. We're going to start doing hopefully a once a week or maybe twice a week video blog and try to touch on some serious points about farming and economy and politics and food and all the things that occupy my mind, and I'm try to keep it current. But I'm in the middle of one of my farms here, and this is a coffee MacNut operation in Honolulu, Hawaii. And the coffee's just starting to flower now, and we're just picking MacNuts, and it's all organic. And I want to approach this blog eventually approach it as a teaching tool to show people how you can do it organically. You know, there's a lot of pushback right now against the chemical companies for their chemical, high-intensive, capital-intensive farming, and people are starting to realize that the food that they've got, or the food-like substances that they put in the supermarkets, are toxic, and they're full of chemicals. No matter how much science they throw at us and tell us they're not, we know they were developed as weapons of war. We know that most of the insecticides are organophosphates. Exactly the chemicals that the UN tested for in Syria to prove that Assad was using chemical weapons. They were testing for organophosphates and ricin. And that really, when I heard the news report that organophosphates were found on the battlefield in Syria, and therefore Assad must be using chemical weapons, and we sent in American Al-Qaeda and all kinds of revolutionaries to overthrow the government and killed a bunch of, millions of people are displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed. I realized that in Hawaii, the UN could come here and go into anyone's backyard and find evidence of chemical weapons, because everybody here uses organophosphates like crazy. They're nuts. They're nutcases, literally. And for every imagined possible pest. And one of the big pests we have here right now in Hawaii is the coffee berry bean borer, and it was brought in because they had convinced everybody here in Hawaii that the only way we could have a viable coffee industry was to bring in cheap, crappy green coffee from other places and blend our coffee with that and sell it to tourists. Totally flies in the face of any real economic theory. I can't believe the University of Hawaii, the state government, or anyone allowed green coffee from places around the world in here, into Hawaii, with all the diseases that are around the world. This is the first big disease that's come in now on these imported berries. I'm trying to stop it, and there's complete resistance. They just act like I'm kind of a crazy person for wanting to not allow a cheap commodity come in and threaten our very expensive commodity. And somehow they have everyone believing that by bringing in super cheap, and I'm talking 1/10 the price, green bean into Hawaii, that somehow that keeps the price of coffee up for the farmer. No facts, no nothing. They're just making stuff out of thin air. They're pulling it out of their asshole, and they think that they're scientific. And that really gets me to what I really want to rant about here, is how they've taken economics, which used to be a philosophy, used to be called social philosophy, and when they finally created the Federal Reserve, they turned economy into a science. And somehow in the modern world, when you put the label that this is a science, then everyone thinks it's true and untouchable. Philosophy means we have a series of different opinions, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to figure it out. But science means there's some kind of fact that's proven it. And right now, economics is a science, which is all complete bullshit. And it's only a science because of what happened about 100 years ago with the creation of the private Federal Reserve that prints and loans money to the federal government. And it really affects everybody and everything, where we actually have this feeling that we need cheap commodities and we need cheap food to have a civilized country. And that cheap food is good for us on every level. It lets us have more money to buy cars and DVDs or whatever. I don't know. What are people buying these days? iPads and blenders. I don't know. But the less you spend on food, the more you can spend on fun stuff. And that's a complete fallacy. Any economist, a true economist, and I'm not talking about the economists, the scientific economists that come on NBC or CBS or any of those, MSNBC or whatever. These are just professors. These guys are just spouting the system rap. The guys who talk about the stock market as if it's not being manipulated. The guys who talk about the dollar as if it isn't a completely fraudulent currency. These characters that are telling us, oh, invest in this stock or don't invest in that stock, or the guys who are trying to sell us on credit cards and stuff like that. This is a complete bogus scam perpetrated on us, and this is kind of what I want to talk about. But here, this is coffee right here, and it's just starting to flower. Here, let me show you coffee. So when I first came to Hawaii, the first farmers meeting I went to was a coffee farmer meeting, and I was literally laughed out of it when I suggested, how come we aren't growing coffee organically? And they said, impossible, you can't do it, absolutely impossible. Well, it's not impossible. It's being done by a lot of people. A lot of the winners of the coffee cupping contest were all organic. And now the coffee farmers over here are basically science fiction farmers. I call them sci-fi farmers. They're using all kinds of chemicals. And a lot of them are banned chemicals because of this coffee berry borer. They're very proud of themselves. They're using chemicals that probably shouldn't even be used in a warehouse where there's no food. So when you buy Kona coffee and it's not organic, you know, buyer beware. And then when you come to Hawaii and you want to buy blended coffee, they say, oh, they can bring in blended green coffee from around the world because they treat it. And they treat it with this substance called ethyl bromide. It's a gas. It's only supposed to be used on furniture. But they got an exemption for coffee, so they could bring in the cheap green coffee, which I personally think that a lot of these processes are actually selling as 100% Kona. But who really knows? I mean, we can do the DNA testing. The state could DNA test the blends and all these and the different 100% Kona, and we could prove it tomorrow, but they refuse to do that. The corruption and the criminality to try to make a buck in the 21st century, I put right at the foot of this 100-year-old Federal Reserve system. And the whole concept of cheap food, the whole concept of planting row to row, the whole concept of extremely huge chemically capital-intensive farms, all creation of the Federal Reserve that has not made anybody healthier, has not made anybody happier, has not made our communities safer, has not made our country greater, has not done anything for us but make about a few hundred people extremely, extremely wealthy, while the rest of humanity suffers under the weight of a chemical onslaught that's in every bite of food and food-like substances we consume. So here's so right over here is this coffee. It's a polyculture. We're trimming the coffee. These are the coffee trimming. And right here is a macna tree. And we pick the macnuts off the ground, so you have to keep the macnuts cleared. And the way I keep it cleared, I use a burner. It's like a torch. They won't sell me a gun, I don't think. Or if I did, I have to jump through a bunch of hoops. But I can get pretty much a burner that could wreak a lot more havoc on people. So anyone wants self-defense, you know, just go get yourself a nice little weed burner and put it by your door. I think it'll be a lot better than even a gun. And then we just pick the macnuts up off the ground. Then these are the macnuts. And macnuts are fairly inexpensive because Hawaii has to compete with third world people that do macnuts. And since it's so labor intensive, they haven't quite figured out the machinery yet to pick the macnuts. Macnuts are extremely expensive in Hawaii. And I sell them at about a break even. I think at about $10 a pound I'm breaking even here on kernel. And I sell these in the husk here. They say they're paying $1, but once the processors figure out all the loss and whatever their formula is, you get about 35 cents a pound for these characters. But it's kind of a break even and it kind of works. But what I really want to talk about on this first blog is why I got into farming. I was originally really into politics. I used to think of myself as a populist, and I eventually became an agrarian populist because I really believe that all wealth is created by farmers and people that grow things. You can take one seed, put it in the ground, and get 100 seeds. Those 100 seeds basically are just appear. You know, the labor of the farmer, the sun, the moon, the stars, the wind, the rain, the earth creates it. But all the forces of nature and all the forces of the universe, no, don't send me a bill. So my profit from farming comes from the input of nature, and that nature is our partner.